You're walking through a medieval village. Chickens roam freely in the muddy streets. Children laugh barefoot as they chase dogs between cottages. And the scent of firewood and dung fills the air. But then you notice something odd. The blacksmith sways slightly as he hammers iron. The baker giggles to himself as he kneads the dough. A priest passes by, red in the face, eyes glossy, speaking a little too loudly for early morning. You're not imagining it. Everyone is, to some degree, drunk. Not staggering, not stumbling, but slightly, undeniably intoxicated. And the strangest part? This was normal. What if I told you that for centuries?
Before you relax and drift into this story, I just want to ask you one thing. If you enjoy my voice and the story itself, please let me know in the comments. It really means a lot to me.
Drinking alcohol wasn't a vice, it was survival. This is the story of why, in the Middle Ages, nearly everyone, from kings to peasants, from monks to merchants, lived in a mild state of inebriation. And it wasn't because they were partying. It was because the world around them forced their hand. A story soaked in beer, laced with fear, and stained with the deepest ironies of history. Let's go back. Not to the castles or knights, but to the wells. Or rather, to the absence of clean ones. The Middle Ages were dirty. We know that. But not everyone understands how dirty. Filthy rivers ran through cities, not just carrying waste, but collecting it. Human waste, animal droppings, rotting food, and corpses, yes, actual dead bodies often floated along with everything else. Water wasn't just unclean. It was deadly. Drinking from a stream could mean hours of violent illness or slow, wasting death. Diarrhea, cholera, dysentery. Words that echo through time like whispered curses. And this wasn't just a problem in big cities. Even rural villages, with their thatched roofs and charming green fields, dumped waste into the same sources they drank from. They needed a solution, and they found one. Fermentation. Beer wasn't just a drink, it was a filter. When water was boiled during brewing, many harmful bacteria were killed off. Alcohol content in beer and wine, even if low, further discouraged bacterial growth. So in a world where water could kill you, beer could save you. Of course, it wasn't the beer we know today. Medieval beer was often dark, thick, and low in alcohol. A cloudy liquid with bits floating in it, brewed at home in wooden barrels. It was called small beer or small ale. Children drank it. Pregnant women drank it. Monks brewed it by the gallon. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about staying alive. But there's a deeper layer. Imagine being a peasant, waking up at dawn to work fields until your back breaks, eating rough bread and onions, sleeping on straw beside coughing children. Wouldn't you want a small escape? A warm fog behind your eyes? That faint looseness in the limbs? Alcohol offered that too. A quiet comfort. A way to endure endless days. But not everyone was satisfied with just mild intoxication. The upper classes, nobility, clergy, even royalty, had their own relationship with drink. They didn't drink small beer. They imported wine, flavored with honey and spices, served in goblets. They drank to celebrate, to mourn, to sign treaties, to wage war. They drank to forget the weight of power. And monks, yes, monks, became some of the most skilled brewers in Europe. In the silence of stone abbeys, behind heavy wooden doors, monks developed brewing into an art form. They experimented with flavors, herbs, techniques. They wrote recipes in Latin. Brewing wasn't sin, it was science. Sacred science. Beer sustained them during long fasts. It raised money for their orders. It was considered a gift from God. Some monasteries even set drinking quotas, gallons per monk, per day. But there's a tragic twist here. Because as much as beer protected people from disease, it also dulled their senses. Alcohol became a crutch. It blurred pain, yes, but it also blurred judgment. In a world already starved of education, this fog of mild intoxication became the background hum of daily life. Imagine generations growing up never knowing what full sobriety felt like. And this cultural haze wasn't isolated to one region. In England, France, the German states, alehouses lined the roads. Some villages had more taverns than churches. In Scandinavia, mead was the drink of choice. Honey fermented into a golden fire. In Italy and Spain, wine flowed like water, sometimes literally mixed into municipal supplies. People drank when they were born, at weddings, to funerals. They drank before going into battle. They drank after surviving plague. They drank to forget hunger, loss, betrayal. But the story gets stranger, because even during times of great religious fervor, like the rise of Christianity or the Islamic Golden Age nearby, alcohol persisted. In Christian lands, it was justified. Jesus turned water into wine, didn't he? The Last Supper had wine. The church itself used wine in communion. So how could it be wrong? It wasn't seen as a sin, unless you got too drunk. Which raises a question: how drunk was too drunk? Who decided? And if everyone was always a little intoxicated, then wasn't that just the baseline? The line between sacred and sinful blurred. And then came the feasts. Medieval banquets weren't just about food. They were tests of endurance. Endless courses, gallons of wine, drunken toasts, roaring laughter. Court musicians played lute while nobles slipped into oblivion. Servants rushed to refill goblets, haul away the unconscious, sweep up the vomit. Drinking was performance. Excess was power. But in the shadows, the poor kept drinking too. Not for glory, but for warmth, for calories, for escape. Mothers gave small beer to children like milk. Workers took mugs into fields. Apprentices were paid partly in ale. And every village had at least one man whose liver gave out before his teeth did. Still, it wasn't all bleak. There's something profoundly human here, a universal need to cope, to soften the edges of reality, to find joy even in dark times. Drinking together created bonds, shared stories, music, a sense of community. But as the centuries turned, cracks began to show. The Renaissance brought questions. Science advanced. Sanitation slowly improved. The microscope revealed invisible killers. Germ theory whispered the terrible truth. Alcohol hadn't saved them. It had distracted them. Water needed cleaning, not replacing. Sobriety had power, too. Reformers emerged. Doctors, clergy, early abstainers. They warned of dependence. They preached moderation. Temperance movements flickered on the horizon. But for the medieval mind, those ideas were foreign. You didn't stop drinking. You just drank better. And so the tradition lingered. Even today, echoes remain. Ever wonder why beer is tied to community in so many cultures? Why pubs feel like home? Why wine is holy? Why we toast to life, to love, to memory? It's not just tradition. It's a relic of survival. So the next time someone tells you the Middle Ages were all about war and religion, remind them they were also about ale, about fermentation, about that subtle, ever-present fog. Not because people were reckless, but because the world gave them no choice. The real question isn't why everyone was slightly drunk, but how they endured without it. Somewhere deep in a 13th century village, a little boy watches his mother ladle beer into a wooden cup. It's breakfast. He drinks slowly. It's warm, earthy, strange, but it's all he's ever known. No one tells him this is alcohol. No one calls it dangerous. To him, this is just water. This is where it gets uncomfortable for us, looking back, because our modern instincts scream, how could they let children drink alcohol? But we forget that context is everything. It wasn't seen as a vice, it was a replacement. They weren't giving kids vodka. They were giving them the safer liquid available. Small beer, barely strong enough to make a grown man yawn. But even this had consequences. Generations were raised on low-grade intoxication. Not stumbling drunk, but numbed, slowed, altered. What does it do to a society when nobody ever sees the world fully clear? When the line between reality and illusion is always slightly blurred? In the monasteries, this became philosophy. Monks debated whether intoxication brought them closer to God or further from him. Was the warmth of ale a divine blessing, or a temptation of the flesh? Some orders set strict limits. No more than a liter per meal. Others gave up trying to regulate and just embraced it. Brewing became holy work. Abbeys kept recipes more secret than scripture. In fact, some of the finest beers in Europe today, the strong Belgian Trappist Ales, trace their roots back to these cloistered breweries. But let's move to the battlefield. Warriors didn't drink just to celebrate. They drank to kill. Before battle, soldiers were given strong wine or ale, laced sometimes with herbs. For courage, they said. For numbness. For fire in the blood. Imagine standing in a muddy field, sword in hand, facing a line of enemies. Wouldn't you want to feel a little less alive? Drunkenness dulled fear, quieted doubt. It made monsters of men. But sometimes it also made fools. There are stories, forgotten in dusty chronicles, of battles lost because knights were too drunk to follow orders, of soldiers falling asleep during watch, of drunk commanders mistaking friends for foes. The same drink that brought courage could bring catastrophe. And it didn't stop in war. Injustice, too, had its rituals of intoxication. Public executions in medieval cities often turned into festivals. Crowds gathered, not just to witness death, but to drink. Beer was sold in buckets. Children ran between carts. Jugglers and musicians entertained the masses. A man's final moments became an excuse for communal intoxication. Why? Maybe because the spectacle of death was too brutal to face sober. Or maybe because the people had forgotten what sobriety even felt like. But there's a twist. Because while the common folk drowned reality in small ale, the elites developed taste. In royal courts, wine became a symbol, not just of luxury, but of culture. Imported wines from southern vineyards were prized like jewels. They were aged in barrels, seasoned with herbs, decanted in crystal. Kings had royal tasters. Nobles held wine contests. A whole language of flavor was born. Dry, floral, earthy. Spiced, bitter, sweet. And this was no accident. Wine was power. To serve wine was to show refinement. To reject beer was to reject peasantry. To sip, not guzzle. To taste, not consume. But don't be fooled. Behind that veil of elegance, royals still drank heavily. They just did it with more ceremony. One German emperor was said to consume over 6 liters of wine a day. English monarchs held drinking games that lasted until dawn. In France, banquets ended with so much wine spilled across tables that servants slipped while clearing the silverware. Even queens were not exempt. Some were praised for their moderation. Others were whispered about behind fans. Red cheeks, slurred speeches, giggles in solemn court. Alcohol was everywhere, even on ships. Medieval sailors couldn't trust seawater, so barrels of ale were stocked on every voyage. On long trips, the beer sometimes spoiled, leading to weaker, sour versions called ship beer. But no one dared go without. A sober sailor was a sick sailor. Rum came later, but beer was first. And in the north, Vikings drank mead, a fermented honey brew, in horn cups during feasts lit by fire. They toasted the gods, sang battle songs, and sometimes passed out on the dirt floor, dreams full of Valhalla. But even here, drink was dual-natured. It gave voice to their myths and violence to their rage. The same horn that poured joy could pour death. But let's step away from the grand and back to the ordinary. In a small cottage, a woman stirs a pot of porridge. Next to her, a clay jug of ale. It's not about pleasure. It's about hydration. Her husband coughs in the corner. The children argue. She drinks, slowly, just enough to dull the ache behind her eyes, just enough to get through another day. This was the rhythm of medieval life. A glass here, a mug there. From dawn to dusk, alcohol was the companion of survival. And yet, not everyone accepted it. The church, split by paradox, struggled. Wine was sacred. Jesus drank it. The Eucharist required it. But drunkenness was still sin. Priests delivered sermons about moderation, often while tipsy themselves. Some saints renounced drink entirely. Others performed miracles involving wine. One story tells of a monk who prayed over poisoned wine, drank it, and lived. Another tells of a nun who turned water into beer for starving pilgrims. Miracles or metaphors, faith or folklore, but through it all, one truth endured. In a world full of plague, famine, war, and dirt. Alcohol was one of the few constants. Until that began to change. Science stirred. Cities grew. Printing presses spread ideas faster than wine could dull them. And somewhere, someone asked, what if we could drink clean water? The question was revolutionary. Engineers began designing aqueducts. Physicians studied disease. Boiling water for tea, a foreign custom brought from the East, began gaining popularity. Coffee houses opened in London. People sat down, wide-eyed and alert, sipping black liquid that sharpened the mind instead of softening it. The world was waking up. But that's a later chapter. In the medieval one, the haze still holds. People laughed more easily, cried more often, fought quicker, loved harder, not always because of drink, but often with it. And behind every mug was a story of survival, of celebration, of sorrow, of stubborn humanity. You might imagine that people in the Middle Ages drank because they didn't know better, that they didn't understand the dangers of alcohol. But that's not quite true. They knew. There are writings from the 11th and 12th centuries warning about the effects of too much drink. Poems mocking drunks. Church sermons calling it a sin. Medical texts, like those of Hildegard of Bingen or Avicenna, recommending moderation and warning that alcohol could damage the brain and the humors. They had words for it: drink fool, ale-addled, wine-sick. They knew what it meant to wake with a pounding head and an empty purse. But despite the warnings, the culture never changed. Not really, because it wasn't just about desire, it was about necessity. And so the contradiction endured. Alcohol was both medicine and poison. It healed the sick and made them sicker. It built friendships and destroyed families. It warmed cold nights and started countless fights. It was the lifeblood of cities. It was also their downfall. Let's walk into a medieval tavern. The air is thick with smoke. Straw litters the floor. There's laughter, shouting, a lute in the corner. At one table, farmers drink after a long day in the field. At another, two merchants argue over prices. At the back, two lovers whisper beside a candle. The drinks come cheap. The room smells of sweat, ale, and roasted meat. Time is irrelevant. The sun might be setting. It might be rising. No one knows. No one cares. This isn't just a bar. It's the social hub, the courtroom, the stage, the therapist's office. Here deals are made. Secrets are spilled. Marriages begin and end. And beneath all of it, the slow, steady drip of alcohol. Now shift your gaze. Far from the noise. A monastery high in the hills. A cloister of silence. But even here, in the quiet, beer flows. Brewed by candlelight, stirred by prayer. A monk dips a wooden ladle, tastes, nods. The balance is right. The bitterness is holy. He writes the recipe in a scroll. 1 handful of grut, 6 days to ferment, store in the cellar. These recipes, passed down through generations, were more than instructions. They were survival guides, because when famine struck, beer fed the poor. When disease spread, beer soothed the pain. When water failed, beer sustained. So who can blame them? Would we have done any differently? Let's imagine you're a traveler. It's the year 1327. You've walked for days. Your boots are worn, your throat dry. You enter a village. Children play in the dirt. A woman stirs a pot. A boy hands you a wooden mug. It's beer. Not cold. Not carbonated. Not refined. But safe. Nourishing. Human. You drink. The edge fades. The pain dulls. You smile just a little. This was the experience of millions. A shared memory. Constant thread. But slowly the pattern frayed. As cities grew and sanitation improved, other drinks emerged. Tea arrived from Asia. Coffee from the Arab world. Distilled spirits appeared. More potent, more dangerous. Gin, brandy, whiskey. Suddenly, alcohol wasn't a mild fog. It was fire. And people got burned. But in the medieval era, the line had not yet been crossed. Spirits were rare. Wine was expensive. Beer was the baseline. Everyone was slightly drunk, but not obliterated. Not wrecked, just softened. Even laws reflected this. Some cities had beer curfews. Others regulated the alcohol content. In London, there were ale conners, officials who tested beer to ensure quality. If a tavern served weak ale or overcharged customers, it could be shut down. Drinking wasn't just culture, it was governance. And then came plague. The Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing millions. Entire towns vanished. Mass graves filled the countryside. Panic gripped the survivors. And in the chaos, drinking surged. Not just to forget, but to explain. Some believed the plague was punishment for sin, including drunkenness. Others believed drinking could purify the body. Wine was prescribed as medicine. Beer was given to plague doctors. People drank more, not less. And through it all, the taverns stayed open. There are records of people dancing, drinking, singing even as bodies piled in the streets. A kind of defiance. If death was coming, they'd meet it with a raised cup. It's easy to judge that now. But maybe they knew something we've forgotten. That in the face of chaos, celebration is resistance. That a shared drink can be a shield against despair. That sometimes being slightly drunk is the only way to keep going. And so the Middle Ages staggered on. Century after century, through war and peace, through harvest and famine, the ritual endured. Brewing, pouring, drinking, a rhythm older than memory. Even language reflects this. To toast someone, that comes from dropping spiced toast into wine, believed to improve its flavor. The word bridal? It originally meant bride ale, the beer served at wedding feasts. Words carry the past like dust in their corners. We live in a different world now. Clean water, regulated food, science, medicine. But that doesn't mean we're better, just different. Because the people of the Middle Ages weren't fools. They were survivors. They used what they had. And they clung to drink not for indulgence, but for endurance. Think of a medieval peasant waking at dawn. The sun hasn't risen yet. The air is cold. His bones ache from yesterday's labor. He reaches for a loaf of bread, hard as stone, and washes it down with a mug of ale. Not for pleasure. For fuel. For warmth. For the slow trickle of strength that only fermented grain seems to give. And then he walks. To the fields. To the market. To the Lord's estate. It doesn't matter. The drink in his veins dulls the chill, eases the weight of time. It's not intoxication. It's insulation. Now think of the noble. He sleeps later. Wakes in linen sheets. A servant brings mulled wine, spiced, warm, rich. He sips it before even rising. Not from thirst, but from habit. The aroma of cloves and cinnamon fills the room. Imported spices, rare and costly, floating in the crimson liquid. A symbol of status. He hasn't worked the land, but he drinks from it. 2 men, 2 lives, 1 liquid binding them. But what about women? In the Middle Ages, women brewed the beer. Before it became industrialized, brewing was a domestic task, part of running a household. Known as alewives, these women crafted beer in their kitchens, boiling mash over fire, tasting for quality, fermenting in wooden barrels. Some sold it, supporting their families. Others gave it freely, as neighbors do. They wore tall hats so customers could spot them in the market. Carried brooms outside their doors to show when ale was ready. They even kept cats to protect the grain from mice. Does it sound familiar? Hats, brooms, cats. Centuries later, these practical signs of female brewers were twisted into symbols of witchcraft. The image of the witch born, at least in part, from women who dared to profit from beer. It's a bitter irony. The drink that sustained so many was also a weapon used to silence. And yet their legacy remains. Every time a pint is poured, every time foam rises over the rim, it echoes their hands. Their knowledge. Their uncredited contribution. Meanwhile, the drink itself evolved. By the late Middle Ages, beer was no longer just grain and water. Brewers experimented. They added herbs grut to flavor and preserve. Sweet gale, yarrow, rosemary. Every region had its secrets. Some recipes were passed down orally, guarded like treasure. Then came hops. It changed everything. Hops extended shelf life, balanced sweetness with bitterness, and gave beer a new identity. At first, many resisted. Hopped beer was too bitter, they said. Unnatural. But slowly it spread. From Germany to England to the Low Countries. Monasteries adopted it. Towns taxed it. And the modern beer as we know it was born. But what about those who didn't drink? They existed rarely. Some religious sects abstained. Some individuals took vows. But they were exceptions. Curiosities. Most people didn't understand how one could go without. To refuse drink was to step outside the culture. To say no to hospitality, to tradition, to communion. Even contracts were sealed with ale. There are records of land deals, marriages, even peace treaties ratified not by ink, but by drink. Two men shake hands. They raise a mug. They drink together. Now the deal is real. Now it's binding. It was more than symbolism. It was sacred. Because in a world without screens, without phones, without instant anything, moments had to matter. Drinking together meant sharing time, breath, trust. And alcohol smoothed the edges. Made strangers into companions. Made fear into laughter. That's why taverns were so essential. They weren't just places to buy a drink. They were the beating hearts of towns. News spread there. Rumors began. Ideas were born. A traveler could enter one as a nobody and leave with stories. Or scars. Sometimes both. And in these dark corners, with candlelight flickering against stone walls, history turned. Think of rebels planning revolts, whispering over ale. Think of poets composing lines, drunk on more than words. Think of peasants laughing even as the plague crawled closer. Think of monks debating God, mugs in hand, trying to define the soul through barley and hops. Even the law made room for it. Some punishments included fines in beer. Some crimes were committed because of beer. And in many towns, there were designated drunk tanks, not for criminals, but for citizens who had simply gone too far. Because everyone understood, drink was normal. Over-drink was dangerous. And so, the line danced, thin, trembling, always at risk of being crossed. Let's pause and imagine the taste. Not crisp like modern lagers. Not chilled. Medieval beer was warm. Flat. Slightly sour. Depending on the region, it could be thick with yeast or flavored with wild herbs. It was cloudy. Alive. Sometimes with floating bits of grain or fruit. But to them, it was life. To us, it might taste like rot. To them, it tasted like home. This raises a deeper question. What did it mean to live in a state of slight drunkenness? Not tipsy. Not reeling. But always faintly shifted? Did it dull creativity? Or inspire it? Did it slow the mind? Or free it? Did people see the world more beautifully or less accurately? Maybe all of that is true. Maybe alcohol was both their lens and their veil. Maybe that's why so much of medieval art is full of duality. Heaven and hell. Saints and sinners. Laughter and death. Painted in the same brushstroke. Sung in the same hymn. Because the people themselves lived in that blur. That in-between. Slightly drunk. Slightly dreaming. Slightly real. Now picture a feast. Long tables, candlelit halls, roasted meats steaming on silver platters. Laughter rising like smoke. A noble's birthday, perhaps, or a harvest celebration. The guests are dressed in velvet, wool, fur. The servants rush between courses, pouring more drink, clearing bones, refilling trenchers of bread. But what are they drinking? Not water. Wine, if they can afford it, imported, spiced, aged in wooden barrels. Mead, thick and sweet, brewed with honey. Ale, strong and warm, flowing freely. There is no such thing as an empty cup. The feast stretches deep into the night. Toasts are made. Challenges are issued. Poets recite verses between burps and belches. A man falls off his bench laughing. A woman sings until she forgets the words. Somewhere, someone cries. Somewhere else, a fight breaks out. This was more than indulgence. It was ritual. A sacred chaos. Because in a world where famine could return any day, where war was always nearby, where death wore 100 faces, a feast was a moment of defiance. A cry of life. And the drink? It turned that cry into a chorus. But not all drinking was joyful. There were dark corners. Cold ones. Like the alehouses on the edge of towns where the poorest gathered. Where the beer was cheap and the spirits were worse. Where desperation floated on every breath. These weren't places of laughter. These were places of forgetting. For a few coins, you could slip into silence. Numb the pain. Blur the memory. The church noticed. Priests warned against drunkenness from the pulpit. Sin, they said. Gluttony. Sloth. Some called it a gateway to evil. Others offered confession, penance, forgiveness, but never without warning. Alcohol, they said, could make a man forget God. And yet, monks brewed beer. Churches stored wine. Even the Eucharist was soaked in it. This contradiction wasn't lost on people. But they lived with it. They were used to double meanings. A world where the same fire could warm or burn. The same cup could bless or curse. And they weren't wrong. Because not everyone drank the same. Social status mattered. Geography mattered. Even the weather mattered. In colder regions, beer was heavier, darker, more filling. In warmer regions, wine flowed more freely. In cities, drinks were taxed, regulated, tested. In villages, they were shared, bartered, gifted. And then there was the question of age. Children drank. That's a hard truth. But medieval childhood was not like ours. Infancy was dangerous. Many didn't survive their first years. Those who did were often treated as small adults. They worked early, married young. And yes, they drank. Not heavily, but enough. Small beer brewed with less grain, less alcohol was often safer than water. It was given at breakfast, lunch, and supper. It was part of the meal, not separate from it. Some parents diluted it. Others didn't. And so generations grew up in this gentle haze. Never fully sober. Never fully drunk. Just softened. But what does that do to a culture? What happens when entire populations are slightly altered always in their perception, reaction, emotion? Maybe it explains the stories. The talking animals. The saints who bleed gold. The forests that shift shape. The dragons. The witches. The demons hiding in trees. Maybe the world was seen through fermented eyes. Not wrong. Just different. More symbolic. More vivid. Less rational, perhaps, but more poetic. Because alcohol doesn't just change behavior. It changes imagination. Think of the medieval festivals. Carnival. May Day. Midsummer. These weren't small affairs. They were explosions of joy. Masks. Music. Painted faces. Dancing in circles. Men dressed as women. Women dressed as queens. The world turned upside down. And always the drink. Ale in horns. Wine in skins. Meat in bowls. Shared. Spilled. Passed from hand to hand until no one remembered who they were. That was the point. For a day, peasants could be kings. Fools could be prophets. Everything blurred roles, rules, reasons. And then as the sun rose, the spell broke. The drink wore off. And the world returned to its hard edges. But for a night, it had all made sense. This too was part of why people drank. Not to escape reality, but to reshape it. To lift the veil. To dream together. And in this dreaming, they found truth. Not the truth of facts and numbers, but the truth of feeling. Of hope. Of grief. Of joy. The kind of truth that can't be measured, only tasted. So when we look back and say they were always slightly drunk, we must be careful. That phrase sounds like mockery. It isn't. It's a glimpse into a mindset. A culture. A survival strategy. A kind of magic. Because what we call drunkenness, they might have called clarity. Now follow the trail of barrels. They didn't just stay in one place. They moved, rolled across borders, sloshed on carts, floated down rivers. Drink was trade. Drink was currency. Merchants carried wine from France to England, beer from Flanders to Scandinavia, meat from the Baltics to the Black Sea. And with every shipment came stories. A French vintner boasting his soil grew grapes kissed by angels. A German brewer claiming his hops cured melancholy. A Byzantine merchant swearing his honey wine could make a dead man sing. Of course, much of it was myth. But no one cared, because the Middle Ages thrived on belief. If something felt true, it was true for that moment, especially after a few drinks. And so taverns became ports of the imagination. A man could walk in a farmer and leave a hero. A woman could arrive grieving and leave laughing. The drink didn't fix anything, but it reminded them that life, even hard life, could sparkle for a moment. Even monks cloistered, silent, removed from the world, understood this. They brewed in silence, perfected it, measured it, honed it like a sacred craft. In places like St. Gall and Cluny and Weihenstephan, brewing was prayer made physical. They recorded recipes, refined yeast strains, controlled fermentation long before science could explain it. And their beer? It wasn't weak. Some monastic brews reached 10% alcohol or more, thick, heavy, golden as wheat at harvest. One mug and you didn't talk to God. You heard him. Pilgrims came not just for relics and blessings, but for the drink. It was safer, stronger, holier. And in the echo of the cloisters, with sunlight slicing through stained glass, a sip of sacred ale was an invitation to the divine. But for many, the drink had a darker pull. It became a mirror. When someone lost everything, their land, their child, their health, they turned to drink not for joy, but for forgetting. The Middle Ages had no therapy, no clinics, no helplines. What they had was ale. And so, in the shadows of cities and villages, people drank to disappear. There were no diagnoses, no medical terms for addiction, but everyone knew the signs. The trembling hands, the slurred speech, the angry nights, the quiet mornings. They just called it being cursed, or weak, or broken. And still, they poured another mug. But not every story ended that way. Some drank and sang. Some drank and healed. Some drank and remembered better. Because memory was slippery in those days. So much of life went unrecorded, no photos, no diaries, no videos. Just voices, stories, and drink helped release them. Old men recalled their youth more vividly after wine. Women recounted births, deaths, weddings, lost loves. Soldiers described battles with trembling accuracy after ale. The drink pulled open the past, raw and vivid. And listeners leaned in. That's how history passed, not in books, but at tables. By firelight, with cups in hand. So yes, they were slightly drunk. Almost always. But in that slight drunkenness, they were more honest. More open. More human. And then there's the question we've avoided. Why was the water so bad? The answer isn't simple. In some places, water was clean, mountain springs, deep wells, fast rivers. But in cities, especially growing ones like London, Paris, and Cologne, water was a threat. It flowed near sewage, under slaughterhouses, past leaky latrines. It carried waste. Disease. Death. People noticed. They saw what happened when a family drank from the wrong stream. They smelled it. Buried the dead from it. So they turned to the safer choice. Fermented drinks, even weak ones, were boiled in preparation. The alcohol content, though small, killed bacteria. It wasn't a conscious scientific decision, but it worked. And people stuck to what worked. That's why when plague came, some doctors prescribed wine. Why priests offered ale in hospitals. Why parents gave beer to toddlers. They didn't trust water. Not because they were ignorant, but because they'd seen too much. And so the mug became a shield. A way to drink without risk. A habit that, over time, became identity. Let's go back to the street. A cobbler finishes his day. Sore hands. Stiff back. He walks to the alehouse. Sees a friend. They sit. They don't say much. Just share a drink. And in that silence, something unspoken is shared, a life survived. A burden carried. Now imagine that scene multiplied 1,000 times. In every village. Every town. Every evening. Like a heartbeat, steady, warm, constant. That's the rhythm of the Middle Ages. Not castles and crusades, but quiet cups between workers. Slight drunkenness. A small light against a dark world. Now let's enter the mind of a traveler. A man on a pilgrimage, feet blistered, cloak stained with dust. He carries little, a pouch of coins, a tooth from a saint, maybe a scrap of bread. His destination lies far away, Santiago, Canterbury, Rome, but tonight he stops at a roadside inn. He's offered a bed of straw and a wooden cup. It's filled with something dark, foamy sharp. He drinks. The ache in his legs doesn't vanish, but it dulls. The fear in his chest doesn't leave, but it loosens. Around him, others do the same. Strangers, speaking different tongues, united in silence by this shared act. No one asks for water. It's a small detail, but it tells you everything. To drink was to belong. To be human. To be part of something older than fear. And in the dim glow of that medieval tavern, as music rises and shadows sway on the wall, the traveler closes his eyes and feels safe. But this isn't just about comfort. It's also about survival. You see, in the Middle Ages, calories were precious. People needed energy not for gyms or hobbies, but to dig, to sow, to march, to endure. Ale gave that energy. It was liquid bread filled with grain and sugar. It kept bellies full when food was scarce. It wasn't always tasty, but it was nourishment, especially when everything else was uncertain. Harvests failed. Winters were long. Famine knocked on the door like an old acquaintance. But the brew, if you had the grain, the fire, the time, could still be made. And so brewing became a kind of insurance. Every village had its brewer. Some good, some not. But they were essential. Like the baker, like the blacksmith. They didn't just provide. They protected. And as the drink filled bellies, it also built bonds. Fathers taught sons how to brew. Mothers taught daughters how to pour without spilling. Neighbors loaned each other yeast, lent barrels, shared hops. Ale became part of the rhythm of life from birth to burial. Yes, even in death. At funerals, the dead were toasted. Their lives remembered with drink. Mugs were raised. Stories told. Some real. Some exaggerated. But that was the point. Alcohol softened the sorrow. Let the tears fall a little easier. Let the laughter come even amid grief. Because life in the Middle Ages was short, brutally short. And yet they found ways to celebrate it. Drink helped. Now step back. See the whole picture. A continent stitched together by rivers of ale, wine, and mead. From the smoky inns of England to the golden vineyards of France. From Polish honey wine to German dunkel to Italian reds. Every culture had its potion. Its recipe. Its ritual. Even the Vikings brewed. When they weren't raiding or sailing, they made mead from honey, fermented it with herbs, and drank it from horns. For them, alcohol wasn't just food, it was sacred. Odin himself was said to have stolen the mead of poetry, a divine brew that gave wisdom and verse to those who drank it. You see the pattern? Over and over, in every corner of the medieval world, drink was never just drink. It was identity. It was myth. It was medicine. It was memory. And so, when we ask why everyone was slightly drunk, the answer is this. Because being sober all the time wasn't practical, or normal, or even safe. Because fermented drink was a necessity, physical, emotional, spiritual. Because it filled the gaps that nothing else could. And because, perhaps, in that slight drunkenness, people remembered how to be a little softer, a little braver, a little more alive. The drink was constant, but it didn't make life easier. It made it bearable. Let's visit a medieval wedding. Not a royal one, just two villagers, young, shy, full of nervous laughter. The ceremony is short. A priest murmurs words in Latin. They nod, repeat what they're told. And then the feast. That's where it begins. Trays of food, bowls of stew, roasted fowl. And drink, so much drink. Ale, cheap and hearty. Wine, if they're lucky. Maybe a relative brought meat from another town. The entire village is there. Children run between tables. Elders clink mugs. The bride's father is already red in the face, eyes misty. Not from sorrow, but from cider. And by nightfall, no one remembers exactly what was said. But everyone remembers how it felt. Warm, wild, alive. This was more than celebration. It was protection. A shield of joy to guard the couple from the harsh world that waited outside. The drink gave courage not just for the night, but for the life ahead. In the Middle Ages, the future was a threat. Drink made it a song. But not every drink was equal. Let's talk about strength. Most people didn't sip strong spirits because they didn't exist yet. Distillation hadn't advanced far enough to make widespread liquor. So medieval alcohol was mostly fermented, not distilled. We're talking about 1 to 8% alcohol in most common drinks. But over time, things changed. By the 12th and 13th centuries, alchemists began experimenting. They discovered ways to extract aqua vitae, the water of life. Clear, strong, burning. The earliest distilled alcohols weren't drunk for pleasure. They were medicines, tonics, cures for plague, for poison, for despair. But it didn't take long. Soon, people drank spirits not to heal, but to forget. And once the door opened, it never closed. By the late Middle Ages, stronger alcohols began to spread: brandy, early whiskey, flavored herbal concoctions. These didn't just blur the edges of reality. They shattered them. But they were still expensive, still rare. For most people, daily life remained wrapped in the gentle fog of ale. And that fog had its own rhythm. Think about time. The medieval calendar wasn't ruled by clocks, but by bells, seasons, and drinks. In the morning, you might start with a weak beer, just strong enough to warm your stomach. At midday, something heavier with lunch. In the evening, a darker ale to end the day. On holidays, everything flowed stronger. Festivals were measured not in hours, but in emptied barrels. Even monasteries had drinking schedules. At some abbeys, monks were allowed a fixed ration, sometimes up to 3 liters a day. And they weren't drinking water. But no one questioned it, because drinking wasn't seen as vice. Not then. It was routine. Only when it tipped into chaos, when a man stopped working, stopped praying, stopped caring, did it become a problem. But how could they tell? There were no tests, no definitions, no terms like alcoholism, just patterns. A neighbor who stopped showing up to market, a husband who raised his hand after the 6th cup, a woman who sat in the same corner muttering to no one. People noticed, whispered, judged, pitted, but mostly they accepted, because the drink was everywhere. Like bread, like air. You could no more ban it than you could ban nightfall. And maybe that's the most important part of the story. The Middle Ages weren't drunk because they were reckless. They were drunk because they were human, because their world was brutal, uncertain, unrelenting. And in that world, a mug of ale wasn't just a drink. It was an anchor, a brief, golden lie that said you were safe, you were warm, you were not alone. And for a few precious moments, people believed it. Now picture a battlefield. Mud, screams, steel meeting flesh. Somewhere in the chaos, a knight clutches his side. Blood soaks through the fabric. He falls. A squire runs to him, frantic, searching for help. No doctors, no anesthesia, only what they have on hand. A flask. He pours the liquid onto the wound, then into the knight's mouth. It burns, but it numbs. Not just the pain in the body, but the horror in the mind. Alcohol was one of the few things that could do both. It wasn't just for celebration. It was for moments like this, where death stood inches away and you had to look it in the eye without flinching. Soldiers marched with drink in their packs. Sailors rationed it aboard ships. Even executioners took a swig before the axe fell, and sometimes so did the condemned. It was mercy disguised as bitterness. And it was everywhere, even in the records. Scrolls and letters describe men who drank the courage of the lion. Chronicles tell of kings who ordered barrels brought to the front lines. Poems hint at warriors who kissed the rim of a cup before kissing death. The drink gave more than comfort. It gave meaning. But in quieter corners, it played another role. Let's visit a healer. An old woman living on the edge of a forest. People whisper that she knows things: plants, roots, the language of bees. They come to her when the midwife fails, when the wounds won't close, when the baby won't cry. She gives them tinctures. Not just herbs, but herbs soaked in wine or spirits. She doesn't explain why. She just knows the drink carries the medicine deeper, faster. And sometimes the drink is the medicine. A cup of mulled wine for a grieving mother. A sip of mead for a frightened child. A draught of herb-infused ale for the man who sees ghosts in his sleep. To the church, she's suspicious. To her neighbors, she's a miracle. And to the people she helps, she's salvation in human form. Through her, we see something crucial. Alcohol wasn't separate from the sacred. It was part of it. Take the Mass, the holiest act of the Christian world. At its center, wine. Red. Symbolic. Sacred. It represented blood, sacrifice, salvation. And it wasn't metaphor. It was ritual. Real wine. Real sips. From golden chalices in cathedrals. From tin cups in small chapels. Every worshipper, from kings to paupers, drank from the same symbol. It united them. And outside the church, festivals blurred the line between holy and human. Feast days meant more than prayer. They meant celebration. Parades, plays, dancing, and drink. In some villages, the lines between sacred and drunken collapsed entirely. Saints' days ended with brawls. Religious processions morphed into carnivals. Pilgrims lost their way, not from poor directions, but from too much wine. Yet no one canceled them. Because even at their wildest, these events reminded people of life. Of joy. Of the few days in the year when suffering took a step back. Even if just barely. And in that narrow margin between belief and indulgence, people lived. They knew the drink could bless and ruin. But so could the sun if it burned too long. They didn't ask for purity. They asked for balance. And most of the time, they found it. Let's step inside a monastery again, but this time not for silence. Behind the stone walls and wooden doors, something is brewing. Literally. Monks move in rhythm, measuring grain, stoking fires, stirring vats. The scent of malt fills the air. Not incense today, but fermentation. Sacred work of a different kind. Monasteries didn't just pray. They produced. Beer, wine, mead, depending on the region, they brewed with precision, care, and a surprising amount of ambition. Some of the finest drinks of the age came from these cloistered men. Why? Because they had time. They had knowledge. They read Latin manuscripts about herbs and chemistry. They experimented with ratios and temperatures. They recorded results. In an age before science had a name, monks were the quiet pioneers of alcohol. But they didn't drink to escape. They drank in moderation with reverence. For them, the brew was not a vice. It was a discipline. And what they didn't drink, they sold. To pilgrims, travelers, merchants. Monastery labels became known across borders. Some still survive today. The Trappist beers you see on shelves? Echoes of monks who stirred silence into every barrel. But outside those peaceful walls, the rest of society drank with less restraint. In towns and cities, taverns pulsed like hearts. Every street had one. Some had dozens. They weren't just places to drink, they were the medieval internet. News spread through tankards. Deals were sealed over cups. Rebels whispered in dark corners. Spies passed notes behind barrels. And gossip? That was the lifeblood. A single evening at a tavern could change reputations, fuel romances, ruin marriages, or inspire revolts. Even revolutions needed a drink first. Take the 1381 Peasants' Revolt in England. Some say it began with words shouted in a tavern, fueled by ale, flamed by fury. Because in the Middle Ages, alcohol didn't just soothe. It stirred. It gave voice to the voiceless. Not always wise, not always kind, but loud. And in an age where power spoke from pulpits and thrones, a drunk crowd was a rare moment of democracy, crude, chaotic, and dangerous. Authorities knew it. That's why they watched taverns closely. Why some towns passed laws on when and how long people could drink. Why preachers raged against the devil in the bottle. But it never worked. Because the drink wasn't the disease. It was the symptom. The real sickness was the world itself, hard, hungry, unpredictable. And people did what they had to do. They worked. They prayed. They bled. And yes, they drank. But let's not forget the other side. Not everyone drank well. For every peaceful tavern, there was a drunken brawl. For every loving toast, a violent outburst. For every laughing feast, a ruined life. It happened. Sometimes quietly, a man losing his trade, slipping into debt, alone at the bottom of a barrel. Sometimes loudly, fights, fires, families torn apart. And even then, there were no words like addiction, no therapists, no clinics. Only judgment, or pity, or silence. But there was one other thing, art. Because in their darkest drinking, people created. Songs, ballads, legends. They sang of tavern ghosts and enchanted wines. They told stories of drunkards who met saints or devils or both. They painted drink as a mirror showing the best and worst in the same reflection. And sometimes in that reflection, they found truth. Imagine the night settling over a medieval village. Lanterns flicker behind shuttered windows. The day's work is done, but the village is not silent. From a small wooden house, music spills out, a lute strumming, voices weaving stories with laughter and song. Inside, neighbors gather around a fire. They pass a cup filled with spiced ale or honeyed mead. The flames dance, reflecting in their eyes, blurring the lines between memory and myth. One by one, they tell tales, not just any tales, but stories born of the drink itself. Of heroes who battled demons fueled by enchanted wine. Of lovers reunited by a shared mug under moonlight. Of fools who spilled their last drop and found fortune in the oddest places. This storytelling wasn't mere entertainment. It was ritual. A way to transform pain into joy, fear into courage, loneliness into belonging. Alcohol was the key that unlocked these stories. It softened tongues and hearts. It freed the spirit to wander realms beyond the harsh realities outside the door. And when dawn crept in, sometimes the story stayed etched in memory, carried forward, shaping the culture of a people who understood that life was both bitter and sweet. But beneath this warmth lurked a darker truth. Because drink was also escape. When harvests failed, when wars raged, when plagues swept through towns, people turned to alcohol to drown grief that words could not hold. The Black Death in the 14th century devastated Europe, wiping out millions. In the wake of such horror, the thirst didn't lessen, it grew. It wasn't just the fear of death, but the agony of loss. Parents buried children, lovers lost partners, entire villages vanished. In that silence, the cup offered a brief reprieve. Some drank to forget. Others drank to remember. The paradox of drink in the Middle Ages was that it was both poison and cure, a medicine for the soul even as it threatened the body. Yet, even with this knowledge, the cycle persisted. Why? Because humans crave relief. Because the human spirit, faced with the unbearable, reaches for anything that promises light, however faint. And in those fleeting moments of warmth, they found something precious. Hope. Hope that the sun would rise again. Hope that pain would fade. Hope that tomorrow might be better. So, in the end, being slightly drunk was not just a habit. It was a survival strategy. A collective ritual binding communities through hardship and joy. It was a way of saying, we endure. We live. We are here. And in that simple act, raising a cup, sharing a drink, the Middle Ages remind us that sometimes the line between despair and celebration is thinner than we think. Picture the bustling streets of a medieval market town. The air thick with the scent of spices, smoke, sweat, and ale. Vendors shout their wares, children dart between carts, animals clatter hooves on cobblestones. It's chaos. It's life. Amid this clamor, taverns beckon like beacons. Their wooden signs swinging in the breeze, their doors wide open, spilling laughter and music into the streets. These taverns were more than places to drink. They were crossroads, where farmers met merchants, where news arrived and rumors spread, where deals were made and broken. For the common folk, these spots were their social networks, their escape valves, their therapy rooms. But there was an unspoken rule: drink with respect. Drunkenness was tolerated, even expected, but excess was dangerous. Not just for the drinker, but for the entire community. A brawl could start over a spilled ale. A drunken insult could ignite a feud lasting years. And authorities, be it the local lord or the church, kept a wary eye. Laws regulated hours of sale, who could serve, how much could be consumed publicly. In some places, you had to be sober enough to stand trial or bear arms. But still, people drank. Because it was woven into the fabric of daily life. Water was often unsafe. Rivers flowed near open sewers. Wells could be contaminated. Ale and beer, being boiled in the brewing process, were safer. In fact, the drink was often healthier than water. It wasn't about getting drunk. It was about staying alive. This practical truth is why monks guarded their brewing knowledge so fiercely and why villages prized their brewers. And yet, beneath the surface, attention brewed. Because alcohol was a double-edged sword. It could heal wounds, but also start fights. It could lighten burdens, but also cloud judgment. It could build communities, but also tear them apart. This tension shaped medieval society in ways we often overlook. It was a dance, a careful balance between celebration and caution, pleasure and peril. And it teaches us something timeless. That human beings have always sought ways to soften the edges of their lives. To turn pain into laughter. To find warmth in cold times. And sometimes, just sometimes, to be a little drunk. Now, let's look closer at who was drinking because it wasn't just peasants or the working class. Nobles, knights, kings, they all drank too. But their relationship with alcohol carried layers of power and politics. Imagine a medieval banquet hall. Tapestries hang on stone walls. Candles flicker in ornate chandeliers. Tables groan under roasted boar, exotic spices, and goblets overflowing with wine. Here, drinking was a performance. A statement. Every sip was a negotiation. Kings toasted allies and enemies alike, sealing pacts and declaring wars through ritualized drinking. The wine wasn't just a drink, it was diplomacy in liquid form. And excess was a sign of wealth and strength. The more you drank without faltering, the more you demonstrated control. But there was a dangerous line. Overindulgence in noble circles could lead to scandal, a king losing his temper, a lord embarrassing himself before rivals. Such moments could weaken authority. So etiquette around drinking developed. Rules about how to drink, when to drink, how much to drink. It was an unspoken code. Violating it could cost a noble his reputation or worse. Yet, even with rules, the bottle held risks. Many kings and nobles were rumored to have struggled with the bottle. Some died young, their health broken by drink. Others made terrible decisions fueled by intoxication that altered history. Take Henry VIII, for example, known for his feasts and excesses. His drinking shaped his moods, his relationships, even the fate of England. So alcohol was a double-edged sword for the powerful, too. It could elevate or destroy. And the stakes were high. Because for nobles, every gesture was political. Every toast, a message. Every hangover, a potential weakness to be exploited. But beneath the glitz, nobles shared a vulnerability with peasants. They drank to face fear and uncertainty. Because power could be isolating. Because behind the velvet robes were humans struggling with the same anxieties as everyone else. In the end, the story of alcohol in the Middle Ages is not just about drink. It's about survival, community, power, and the thin, trembling line that separates control from chaos. The final piece of the story lies in the aftermath, the legacy of medieval drinking and what it teaches us today. Because when we look back, it's easy to dismiss the past as primitive or chaotic. But the truth is far richer. Medieval people didn't just drink to get drunk. They drank to connect, to cope, to celebrate the fragile thread of life in a world that could snatch it away at any moment. And in those mugs and goblets, they found something timeless, a way to face uncertainty together. Fast forward to now. Think about how we drink today. Parties, dinners, celebrations, we raise glasses to bond, to relax, to escape. Is that so different? Maybe not. The Middle Ages remind us that alcohol is woven into the human story, a tool, a comfort, a risk. It holds a mirror to our nature, showing us our strengths, our weaknesses, our desire to belong. But there's a warning too, because that thin line between drinking as ritual and drinking as ruin is still there. And it always will be. What medieval life teaches us is the importance of balance, of respect, of understanding our limits, and most of all, of remembering that behind every drink is a story, a human story. So next time you hold a glass, maybe think of those medieval souls who raised their cups in the face of famine, war, plague, who laughed, cried, and lived with courage and fear, who, like us, searched for a little light in the darkness. Their story is ours, and it deserves to be remembered. As we reach the end of this journey through the Middle Ages, it's clear that alcohol was not just a drink, it was a lifeline, a language, a shield against a harsh world. It connected the sick to healing, the lonely to community, the fearful to courage. It was everywhere, woven into faith, labor, celebration, and survival. Yet it was never without risk, a fragile balance of order and chaos. This delicate dance between necessity and danger shaped a society where nearly everyone lived with a slight, persistent buzz, a world where being a little drunk was just part of being alive. And maybe in that haze, they found a way to endure what often felt unbearable. Today, we look back and see not just drunken peasants or reckless nobles, but human beings seeking comfort and connection in uncertain times. Their story reminds us to appreciate the complexity behind every habit, every ritual, every sip. Because beneath every drink lies a story of humanity, of hope, fear, resilience, and the eternal search for meaning. So next time you raise your glass, remember the countless souls who once did the same, not just for pleasure, but for life itself. And if you want to explore more hidden stories that shape our world, don't forget to subscribe.